Wonderful, heavenly, beautiful, and ours. Lesbian fantasy and mediated desire in heavenly creatures. Before Scahill dives into his essay, he begins with a short summary on the themes of heavenly creatures. On surface level, the film is based on a true story of two girls in New Zealand who form an intense erotic friendship based on a fantasy world they create, and how their forced separation leads them to commit matricide. Scahill points out, though, that there is a deeper meaning. The film is about cinema, desire, and queer spectatorship. For better understanding of Scahill, my presentation will summarize his paper in the order he formatted it in, but also group some paragraphs together according to their level of relevance. There is a distinction between the film being a simple narrative about adolescence, queerness, and matricide, and the film being about fantasy, secrecy, displacement, and constructing a new language of desire. He quotes Cowie's concept of the mise-en-scène of desire, which argues that a film spectator is capable of identifying with not just characters or film narratives, but also the staging and circulation of ideas, motives, and concerns within the film. Indeed, deeper evaluation of the film reveals its core ideas of queer consciousness and spectatorship, which Scahill details in later paragraphs. For now, he suggests that the mise-en-scène of desire in Heavenly Creatures is desire itself, the repressed lesbian desire of Pauline and Juliet that has no language to articulate it into being. The motif of desire and desiring is something Pauline and Juliet do not have the freedom to do in their heterosexual and pastoral environment, so they are unable to even acknowledge it, leading them to unconsciously deny their impulses and direct it to something else. This means that naturally they do not possess a voice to express this desire, hence Scahill's point that this desire has no language to enunciate. Peter Jackson's film of the Parker Hume murder case involves discussions of many theories including feminist, queer, postcolonial, race, and Marxist theories. By close reading the film and applying theory to its analysis, Scahill explains what parts of the film indicate queer, postcolonial, and hierarchical aspects. First, Scahill uncovers the basic outline of Heavenly Creatures. First, Juliet Hume, a wealthy British girl with a love for opera and an active fantasy life. Second, Pauline Parker, a sullen working-class Kiwi girl who narrates the film through her diary entries. Third, Juliet introduces Pauline to a fantasy world that involves crafting romantic stories together and inhabiting both female and male roles. Fourth, the girls' intense bond draws suspicion from Juliet's parents, who demand the girls to be separated. Fifth, Pauline's mother complies, which prompts Pauline to plan her murder with Juliet's help. Sixth, the film ends by informing the viewer that the girls were prosecuted under the folie à deux law, madness shared by two, a shared delusional disorder. Delusional beliefs and hallucinations transmit from one person to the other, and the girls must never speak to each other again after serving their sentences. This short paragraph already prepares us with information and inquiries. The social and economic class difference between Juliet and Pauline is apparent. The nationality difference and Juliet's Anglophilic fantasy world implies a possible post-colonial approach. The negative connotations attached to homosexuality are noticed, as so is the confusion surrounding one's own sexual orientation. Questions also arise. What are the dynamics of Pauline identifying as 4 different names? Paul, Yvonne, Charles, Gina. Why is it that Juliet and Pauline do not cast murder as hatred towards the Humes? Scahill continues to list 3 early and later criticisms of the film, but only to conclude that these analyses do not integrate Juliet and Pauline's fantasies, nor the role of queer spectatorship and cinematic fantasy. The analyses he lists are the following. First, construction of lesbian desire and the subsequent repression of that desire. Second, the articulation of class differences and upward mobility desires. Third, lenses of postcolonialism, examining how the construction of fantasy on the part of the colonized subject, Pauline, was mired in Anglophilic desires, Juliet, Pauline's admiration towards Juliet, and the concept of their fantasy land being a royal kingdom. Instead, Scahill adopts the terms fandom and identification to describe the oversimplification of Juliet and Pauline's desires. By oversimplification, Scahu means that their desires and fantasy creation are too complex to be classified as fandom and identification. Juliet and Pauline struggle to channel their erotic desire as a model for the process of queer spectatorship. Put in simpler terms, they find difficulty in identifying themselves and becoming the object of their lesbian desires. So instead, their emerging erotic desires are traced through the models of incomplete articulation. Fandom, the projected desire. Identification, the object of that desire. Ultimately, through the encounter of both fandom and the identification models of lesbian desire, Julian and Pauline seek out a model of erotic interaction that allows them to project their mutual desires onto an object, fandom, and to become the object of desire itself, identification. The importance of fantasy and its incongruence with reality. In this part of his essay, Scahill turns our attention to the opening sequence of a 1950s tourism film of Christchurch and Christchurch Girls' Academy. The footage displays the academy as a casteless, peaceful, and pastoral colony where good little girls receive a proper British education. This imagery is interrupted by disruptive screaming and running of blood-covered girls. We realize that there is something lurking beneath the surface of this film. We realize that, in fact, the serene scenery of Christchurch is the disruption of what is hidden beneath the so-called official document, that is, the opening tourism film. As Beaver notes, queer subjects are inherently attuned to the beneath, as they are prodigious consumers of hidden potentiality. They are the abnormal subjects that must be whispered with such a level of secrecy and uncertainty. The New Zealand normality, the official discourses of girlhood, family, sexuality, and criminality, is a facade. The queer narrative of Juliet and Pauline is the centrality of this story. From their first encounter, Juliet and Pauline have found many commonalities between them, such as their mutual disdain for authority and the rigid constraints of the hegemonic school system. They even share similar interest in drawing and had similar medical pasts. However, Scahill indicates their national and class differences. Whereas Juliet is an Anglo-British upper class, Pauline is a native New Zealander from the working class. Thus, when Juliet depicts a medieval fantasy where St. George defends himself from a dragon, there is no space for Pauline, as Juliet quotes, "I hadn't gotten around to adding Pauline yet." In Juliet's fantasy, Pauline is an outsider and a spectator. However, it is important to mention how St. George was depicted in the face of Mario Lanza, the Italian-American opera star that Juliet adores. Lanza is depicted as the prime example of a working-class boy made good, and his existence in Juliet's Anglophilic fantasy means there is a possibility that Pauline has an acceptable space into Juliet's fantasy, and like Lanza, a possibility of achieving upward mobility. As previously defined, fandom is Juliet and Pauline's projected desire, and the practice of their fandom is directed at the sensational tenor Mario Lanza and other male movie stars. Although this affectionate desire seems heterosexual, Scahill draws from Ehrenreich et al. To suggest that adulation of the male star is a way to express sexual yearnings that would normally be repressed, evidently referring to Juliet and Pauline's repressed lesbian desires. In fact, Scahill also introduces Sedgwick's theory of the homosexual male-female-male triangle. The two men form an intense but non-sexual bond with each other, where they also compete for the woman's love. Scahill slightly twists Sedgwick's theory into an erotic female-male-female triangle that has its basis in idolatry rather than rivalry. Through their practices of fandom, however, Juliet and Pauline realize that their want to freely express their lesbian desire is powerful. As Kincaid once opined, desire desires desire, not fulfillment. In the montage sequence where the girls frolic about the bushes singing Lanza while undressing themselves, Pauline crosses class borders and participates in Juliet's shared fantasy. It is from this scene their desires become less triangulated and more directed towards one another. An overhead shot of the girls lying in the grass that almost mirrors a matrimonial bed, and their quick kiss they share become the first sign of their homoerotic interaction. In the scene where Juliet and Pauline build an altar for the saints of the fourth world, They announce each saint as he, him, this, and that. Through their ritual, not only do they reify their mutual longings for fandoms, but they also reveal their want to become the object of desire. Through using the non-gendered pronouns this and that to accommodate their cross-gender identification. As the girls gradually realize that the practice of fandom cannot serve their passionate desire, the homoeroticism slowly moves into the territory of identification. The lines between reality and fiction quickly become blurred. Juliet and Pauline spend more time summoning Diallo to eradicate the cause of their anger. Diallo, the son of Charles and Deborah, is a personification of the girls' rage at the hegemonic systems of heteronormativity, religion, and pathology. Diallo is the means by which the girls dismantle heteronormative expectations and become aware of queer consciousness. Fiction once again merges with reality when Juliet and Pauline start playing the roles of the characters of their fantasy kingdom, Borovnia. Juliet adopts the persona of Deborah, and Pauline writes letters to Deborah as Charles. Through these queer heterosexual roles, the girls try to express their lesbian desire. However, they later realize that they do not need to be female and male to express their erotic desires. The girls realize the possibility of erotic desire transmitted from embodied female subject to embodied female subject. According to Scahill, the fantasies the girls create serve a dual function. 1. A space to enunciate desire. 2. A coping mechanism to escape from trauma and to signify reality into a manageable form. An example Scahill gives of the second function is when Juliet finds out her parents are returning to England without her. Upon learning that she will be shipped off to a tropical island again, she seizes upon her vision of the fourth world. Pauline also uses her fantasies to escape traumatic reality, while she, as Gina, has sexual intercourse with John, whom she insists on calling Nicholas. As soon as she enters her fantasy world, she meets her alter ego Charles, but instead of taking over his persona, she turns away from him and Nicholas, and fervently looks for Deborah. Once she finds her, Deborah transforms from her clay figure into the appearance of Juliet. From this moment, Pauline becomes and remains as a female-positioned agent in a newly written narrative. Instead, from this point onwards, Juliet is referred to as Deborah, and Pauline is referred to only as Gina. Given the limits that the girls encounter in both the fandom and the identification models of lesbian desire, Pauline/Gina and Juliet/Deborah seek out a model of erotic interaction that allows them to project their mutual desires onto an object, fandom, and to become the object of desire itself, identification. For the girls, the journey's end brings them to what was once known as the Dream Factory, Hollywood cinema. Juliet/Deborah and Pauline/Gina attend a screening of The Third Man, a movie starring Orson Welles. Back at home, the girls scream as imaginary Welles chases them, and although they find him horrid, they simultaneously find him strangely attractive. According to Scahill, Welles is another image of projected desire for the girls. Welles as an actor suffered hardship throughout his career, but his role, Harry Lime, is also portrayed as a bleak character. A dangerous villain who gradually earns sympathy from the audience, everyone identifies with the seemingly human anti-hero by the end of the show. Welles as Harry Lime lurked in the shadows and the sewers, which is, as Cahill quotes, a fitting metonym for the repressed desire that Pauline and Juliet feel rising to the surface. After this exciting chase, the two girls make love to each other and both fantasize of Borovnia, where clay figures shift and meld into one another, intensifying the pleasure the two girls feel. Juliet/Deborah and Pauline/Gina enact with the shifting and melding of identification, signification, and desire in Borovnia, where their reality lies. The medium of cinema screens a fusion of both queer desire and identification. It provides the mise-en-scène of desire for its spectators. According to Maine, the role of the cinema as a space for exploring queer desire. Indeed, Heavenly Creatures and its extensive meditation on the girls as authors of their own fantasy and narrative offers a welcome corrective to heteronormative paradigms that claim ownership and relegates other modes of deriving pleasure to the margins. If we want to stop queerness being expressed as subtextual and subcultural, We must stop thinking within conventional heterocentrist paradigms. Instead, we must carry out a narrativization of minority spectatorship to claim that space of spectatorship as wonderful, heavenly, beautiful, and ours.